At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mizpah, staring straight into a sky that was actively trying to kill him as black clouds of flak exploded over Budapest. 24 years old, 17 combat missions behind him, and absolutely no room for mistakes. Below him, more than 200 heavy German anti-aircraft guns surrounded the railway yards, all firing at once, turning the air into a wall of steel. Swanson's bomber was one of 60 aircraft from the 483rd Bomb Group flying out of Sterperone, Italy, tasked with a simple mission on paper: destroy the Shell oil refinery and rail hub feeding the Eastern Front, then get home. But by July 1944, crews in the 15th Air Force knew the truth hidden behind the briefing charts. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, only 2 would see the end of the war. The formation pushed forward anyway, flying straight into the barrage as flak bursts ripped aluminum apart like paper. Mizpah taking hits in the tail, then the wings, shrapnel tearing through the fuselage, while the crew stayed at their stations, seconds from the target. In the co-pilot's seat sat Second Lieutenant Paul Burnett. In the nose, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley prepared to release the bombs, with Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigating beside him. 8 other men spread throughout the aircraft: gunners, radio operator, flight engineer, all waiting. Dudley dropped the bombs, 2 tons of explosives falling away as the bomber lurched upward, and in the next instant an 88mm shell struck the nose. The explosion erased the front of the aircraft completely: the bombardier's compartment, the navigator's station, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass. Everything forward of the cockpit simply vanished. Dudley and Henderson killed instantly, the metal structure that had housed them gone in a flash. The sudden loss of weight threw the bomber's center of gravity backward, and Mizpah pitched violently upward into a near-vertical climb, on the edge of a stall. Swanson looked forward and saw open sky where instruments should have been, freezing air at 30,000 feet roaring through a massive hole, 40 degrees below zero. Blood sprayed across the flight deck, wind tearing at his suit, and through the empty space where the nose used to be, he could see the rest of the formation continuing on without him. There was no control yoke anymore. It had been mounted to structure that no longer existed. No instrument panel, no airspeed, no altitude, no artificial horizon, nothing to tell him what the aircraft was doing, except instinct and the horizon framed by destruction. Yet the control cables were still there, steel lines running from the cockpit through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons, now exposed and whipping in the wind. Somehow Swanson forced the nose down, with nothing to push and nothing to pull, somehow leveling the bomber and limping back into loose formation, flying a plane that by every rule of engineering should have been unflyable, kept aloft only by physics and desperation. If you want to hear how this crew did the impossible, hit the like button and subscribe to keep these forgotten stories alive, because this is where it gets worse. Behind Swanson, the surviving crew moved forward, the radio operator, the flight engineer, staring at the exposed control cables running through the bomb bay, understanding instantly what had to happen while German guns were still firing and enemy fighters were still nearby. At 9:44 a.m., another 88mm shell hit engine number 2, the right inboard engine exploding in oil and metal as flames streamed back along the wing, the propeller windmilling briefly before seizing, leaving Mizpah flying on 3 engines, losing speed, falling behind the formation with no instruments to tell Swanson how fast it was happening. Technical Sergeant Frank Gemenzi, a flight engineer, reached the bomb bay and saw the problem clearly. Bundles of steel control cables, normally hidden inside pulleys and fairleads, now completely exposed to a 300-mile-per-hour wind, impossible to control unless someone physically held them. Staff Sergeant George Semelli moved forward from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell from the waist gun position. No debate, no orders, because the situation was obvious. If no one grabbed those cables, the aircraft would die. Communication was nearly impossible, the intercom damaged, Swanson 40 feet forward in what remained of the cockpit, while the crew stood in the bomb bay, guessing what he needed by feel alone. Swanson tried the rudder pedals and nothing happened, tried the throttles and the remaining engines responded, but without control of the flight surfaces, the aircraft would either stall, spin, or dive into the ground. The crew wrapped the cables around their gloved hands, steel biting through fabric, freezing, cutting, and when they pulled left, the aircraft turned left. When they pulled right, it obeyed. When they pulled back on the elevator cable, the nose rose. When they released, it dropped. Every correction delayed, every movement risky, every mistake fatal. All of it happening while Mizpah lagged farther behind the formation, alone over enemy territory, slower, damaged, and running out of luck, with German guns still firing and standard procedure about to collide with sheer human will. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were abandoned, and by 9:46 a.m., Mizpah was alone. The rest of the formation pulling a mile ahead, then two, shrinking into dark specks against the summer sky, while Swanson watched helplessly as his own aircraft began a slow, relentless descent from 30,000 feet to 29, then 28. The loss so gradual it was almost worse because it meant time to think, time for everything to fail. In the bomb bay, the crew kept pulling the exposed control cables, their hands cramping, steel wire biting through gloves, blood flow cut off by pressure and cold as 40 below zero air froze their fingers numb. But they did not let go, because letting go meant death. Swanson had no fuel gauges, no engine instruments, no way to know how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks or how long 3 engines could keep 65,000 pounds of crippled bomber airborne. No navigation instruments, no maps, and no navigator, just one instruction repeating in his head over and over again: fly southwest, get out of Hungary, cross Yugoslavia, reach the Adriatic, reach Italy, get home. Then the men in the bomb bay began waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft, arms slashing through the air, shouting words Swanson could not hear, and he could not turn to look because the wind blasting through the open nose cavity made even shifting in his seat dangerous. Unbuckling would risk being pulled forward and out of the aircraft, so he stayed locked in position, eyes fixed on the horizon, wings barely level, while the crew continued waving because something was wrong behind him, something worse than the missing nose, worse than the dead engine, worse than the exposed cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, felt it first, alone in the narrow tail compartment, the most isolated place in a B-17, as the metal structure around him began to flex and move in ways it never should, the explosion having cracked or weakened key support members, so that now the tail itself was starting to fail. If the tail came off, the aircraft would enter an unrecoverable spin, tumbling end over end until it disintegrated or struck the ground, killing everyone instantly with no chance to bail out. And the men in the bomb bay could see it too, watching the structure shift with each vibration of the engines, knowing there was nothing they could do to fix it. Mizpah passed 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest, Swanson guessing they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5, though every second felt like an hour, as wind noise drowned out thought, cold penetrated every layer of clothing, and his hands on the throttles went numb, the throttles now the only direct control he had left. The co-pilot, Paul Burnett, remained in his seat with no controls and no instruments, scanning the sky for fighters, because lone bombers were hunted by Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, easy kills without defensive support. Yet none appeared, the Luftwaffe either distracted or unaware.
while the crew's coordination improved through necessity as Swanson adjusted engine power and the men in the bomb bay instinctively compensated by pulling rudder and elevator cables, not flying the aircraft so much as forcing it to obey through raw human effort. 10 men functioning as a single organism to keep shattered aluminum in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mizpah crossed out of Hungary into Yugoslavia, though Swanson did not know it because he had no maps and no recognizable landmarks, but he felt it when the flak stopped, the black bursts vanishing from the sky, meaning they were past the worst defenses and had a chance, a small chance, measured in minutes and structural integrity. He could not see the fuel gauges, but he could hear the engines and feel their vibration, steady and strong, meaning fuel was still flowing, though how much remained was impossible to know, as the bomber burned far more than normal running 3 engines at near maximum power, and Swanson made a decision that every pilot dreads, the simplest decision and the hardest one: get the crew out. The aircraft was dying, the tail was failing, fuel was unknown, and every extra minute in the air increased the chance that Mizpah would simply come apart. But if the crew bailed out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would survive, captured, imprisoned, but alive. The problem was how to do it, because standard bailout procedures assumed an intact aircraft, functioning intercoms, assigned exit points and time, and Mizpah had none of those. The nose escape hatch was gone, the intercom was dead, coordination was impossible, and Swanson could not leave his seat even for a second, because the moment he released the throttles and unbuckled, the aircraft would lose its last stable reference, the men pulling cables would have no guidance, and the bomber would dive or spin within seconds, killing everyone. Meaning the pilot who was supposed to give the order to abandon ship was physically unable to do so, trapped in the one position that kept everyone alive, while the clock kept ticking and the tail continued to flex.
Everyone still aboard would die, and by 9:52 a.m., Mizpah was down to 24,000 feet, 10 full minutes of flight without a cockpit. Swanson's hands locked onto the throttles, his boots planted on rudder pedals that no longer controlled anything unless men 30 feet behind him physically pulled steel cables through the bomb bay. Burnett sat rigid in the co-pilot's seat, eyes fixed on the horizon and the wings, watching for the moment the aircraft finally gave up. Neither man speaking because there was nothing left to say, and the wind screaming through the open nose would have swallowed any words anyway. In the bomb bay, the crew made the decision without orders, feeling the tail flex, seeing stress cracks spider across the fuselage skin, understanding with brutal clarity that staying meant dying when the aircraft tore itself apart, so they began abandoning ship. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first, clipping his parachute, stepping into the waist gun window, and vanishing instantly into the slipstream, followed by Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly, then George Semelli, then Flight Engineer Frank Gemenzi, and with every man who jumped, the aircraft became harder to hold together as fewer hands remained on the control cables, the bomber beginning to wallow, wings dipping left then right, the nose creeping upward as Swanson fought back with throttle alone, knowing it wasn't enough, but having no other choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail, squeezing through the narrow crawlway toward the bomb bay as the bomber's nose dropped and the loose control cables whipped uselessly in the wind, the aircraft accelerating into a dive that gave him maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep and the G-forces locked him in place forever. He reached the waist gun area as the aluminum floor vibrated violently beneath his boots, the roar of air overwhelming everything, grabbed his parachute from the rack, clipped it on with shaking hands, staggered to the open window, looked down at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a solid wall, spinning him sideways as the B-17 roared past, only 200 feet away, engine still screaming as it fell. And Swanson pulled the ripcord, the parachute opening with a brutal jerk that ripped the air out of his lungs, followed by sudden, eerie quiet.
He watched Mizpah continue its dive, the rear fuselage flexing like a reed, until at 15,000 feet, the tail finally tore away, the remaining forward section pitching almost straight down and vanishing into a line of trees 2 miles away in a rising column of black smoke as the fuel tanks ignited, leaving no chance that anyone could have survived, and Swanson understood with absolute clarity that 30 more seconds aboard would have killed him. He drifted southwest beneath the canopy, farms and forests sliding slowly beneath him, knowing his war was over and capture was inevitable, trying to steer toward an open field as the ground rushed up faster than expected, only to crash through the tops of trees at roughly 15 miles per hour, branches snapping, canopy snagging, his body slamming into a thick limb as his left leg broke with a clean, sickening snap between knee and ankle. Pain exploded through him as he dropped another 10 feet and came to rest tangled in parachute lines, 15 feet above the ground, blood pouring down his leg, his flight suit shredded, deep cuts burning across his thigh, the leg twisted at an impossible angle, unable to move, unable to climb, suspended and fighting to stay conscious. Below him, he heard German voices as Wehrmacht soldiers arrived within minutes, having seen the parachutes and heard the crash, calling up to him while he hung silent, helpless, watching them fetch a ladder from a nearby farm, 2 men climbing to cut the lines and lower him carefully to the ground, where a German medic examined the shattered leg, splinted it with wooden boards, injected morphine, and wrapped the bleeding wounds as the pain slowly dulled into a distant throb. Swanson was carried to a local command post, then to a Wehrmacht medical facility where a doctor confirmed the fracture, reset the bone despite the pain, and encased his leg in plaster from ankle to hip, explaining through an interpreter that the break was clean, but recovery would take months. And over the next 3 days, every remaining member of Mizpah's crew was captured within a 20-mile radius of the crash site, all alive, all prisoners, the impossible flight finally over.